Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. In the previous episode, we left you on a cliffhanger with the Quebec Campaign, where Benedict Arnold is leading his troops through a vast overland campaign in the winter in Canada. They're facing starvation conditions. Some men are shoeless because they have boiled their shoe leather in order to eat it and are walking through the snow barefoot, trying to lay siege in Canada, and now they are at the gates of Quebec. So, what's going to happen, James?
All right, just let me give a little bit more background in case it's been a while since our listeners have listened to the last one. Arnold had marched up through the wilderness of Maine. As you mentioned, a lot of hardship, people sick, shoeless, really having a hard time. He had tried to lay siege to Quebec with just his own force, but that didn't work. Those stubborn people in Quebec, they just would not surrender, even after he asked 3 times. And so he decided to call off the siege and wait for General Montgomery, who had been in Montreal, to arrive. But Montgomery seemed to take quite a while. In the meantime, the British overall commander, General Guy Carleton, also came up from from Montreal to Quebec and reinforced the defenders in Quebec. And that's where we left off. And now Montgomery finally arrives on December 1st, but he only has with him at this time 500 men. Again, the cold and just disease in general had been working as a team to reduce the force greatly. They'd had a few skirmishes with the British as well. So Montgomery's force is greatly reduced from what it originally was when he stepped off from New York State a while back in the fall. Okay, so Montgomery and Arnold combine their forces. They try again to lay siege to Quebec, and now they have a combined force of about 1,100. But unfortunately for them, the British now, with Carleton and his reinforcements, they have about 1,800. So the attackers have 1,100. The Americans, the British, the defenders have 1,800. That is not good odds, particularly when your defenders are behind walls, when they're fortified, heavily fortified. Finally, though, on December 31st, after almost a month, Arnold and Montgomery decided to assault the town under cover of a snowstorm. So the snow is falling, a blinding snow you can't hardly see in front of you. The Americans charged through this, hoping to catch the British by surprise. And for a while, they succeed. They broke into the weakest part of the city, which is called the Lower Town. Daniel Morgan's riflemen that we mentioned in our last discussion, they played a very large part in the attack. They were key in picking off soldiers. They were really good sharpshooters, or snipers, we would say today. They didn't use that term back then. But even though the Americans broke through into the Lower Town, they could not penetrate the heavier defenses of the Upper Town. And many Americans were killed, including, I'm sorry, not killed in this case. Some Americans got trapped. There are some killed as well. But right now I want to highlight the ones that were trapped. Daniel Morgan himself is trapped, and they had to surrender. Now, speaking of people who were killed, unfortunately for the Americans, General Montgomery, who's in overall command, he was killed. So General Montgomery, he's out of the picture. Benedict Arnold is not killed, but he's very seriously wounded. He's shot through the leg. The Patriots suffered about 450 casualties, of whom about 50 were killed or wounded, and about 400 were captured. So that's a lot of prisoners. And I'm going to mention in passing that eventually 1/4 of these that were captured changed sides. They went over to the British. So that's kind of ironic, isn't it? So 100 of Benedict Arnold's soldiers switched sides. Arnold was probably cursing them, but be careful.
He had subtle influence on them, I guess.
Yeah, don't judge. The British took perhaps 40 casualties, not nearly as many as the Americans. Arnold, he pulls back, he resumes the siege, but it's just not going to happen. He finally has to leave the army himself. He leaves them behind under the command of General John Sullivan. he's got his leg injury is just too bad. He's got to get that taken care of. Finally, on March 4th, 1776. So this is quite a long time. This is 4 months. Arnold had reached Quebec originally on November 8th, 1775. Now we're up to March of 1776. A British fleet brings 7,000 reinforcements under General John Burgoyne to Quebec. And again, he's going to occupy a lot of our attention later on. But for now, he's just going to park his forces there. 7,000, that's too much even for Benedict Arnold to deal with. Benedict Arnold was very aggressive, very confident in his own abilities and the abilities of his men. But, I mean, come on. Like 500 or 600 people can't take on 7,000 plus. So Arnold has to retreat upriver to Montreal. During the retreat, many of the Patriot force died of smallpox, which occasionally would break out and decimate the American troops and the British as well sometimes. So also, Arnold's men were hungry. They were suffering from famine or just almost starving to death. They had to raid farms of the habitants, the French people that they were hoping to win to their side, and of course that's not gonna help your cause very much.
Yeah, I mean it's a little bit ironic that in a sense it's a mirror image, not exactly, but the British experience in the colonies, where they come expecting to be great liberators, but by trying to live off the land, they alienate the people who live there. So the Americans are just paying it forward to Canada.
Exactly. It's one thing to criticize the Catholic Church, but then when you start stealing my food, now that's serious. So a lot of these French-speaking Canadians say, "Oh, forget this. We're sticking with the British." Carleton finally, the British commander Guy Carleton, he decides he's going to go on the offensive. In early June, he fights off an American counterattack. Arnold has to pull out of Montreal back into the United States. Carleton constantly hits him from behind, and he moves to Fort St. John, which he captures, and it goes back into British hands. The Patriots, now, as I mentioned, they're under the command of John Sullivan. They retreated from Fort St. John, and this is what Sullivan wrote. He wrote, "I found myself at the head of a dispirited army, filled with horror at the thought of seeing their enemy. Smallpox, famine, and disorder had rendered them almost lifeless." Another person in the army, another Patriot soldier, he wrote this. He said, "Lice and maggots were creeping in millions over the victims."
Ugh.
So it's just horrible. It's something almost like something out of a horror movie.
It sounds like when Napoleon's army are retreating from Russia, that type of thing.
I'm sure there's some similarities there. You're dealing with cold and famine and disease and discouragement. They just keep getting driven back and back. Carleton orders the building of a fleet that was to sail down Lake Champlain deep into American territory toward Fort Ticonderoga. Here we see the genesis of a plan to cut the colonies in half. Carleton is hoping that through a combined army and navy, he can go down the Hudson River, take control of it, and that'll isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. If we can get New England bottled up and basically put them under siege and conquer New England, then the other colonies will fall into line. That's the plan. And is it going to work? Let's find out. Let's see. Carleton is sailing down, but he is stopped at Valcour Island. Valcour Island is an island in Lake Champlain, and he didn't see that there were some American gunboats there, 13. And guess who they were under the command of? Well, you've got the notes, Scott. So
that's not fair.
Scott is disqualified from guessing, but listener, can you guess which American was commanding these boats? It's Benedict Arnold. There he is again. Benedict Arnold has recovered somewhat from his injury, and Benedict Arnold stops this British fleet. And this is a battle that almost nobody's ever heard of, and I'd love to go into more detail, but we don't have time. But the Battle of Valcour Island, some say right here, right now, Arnold saves the revolution. He stops the British from going any further south. Carleton turns around and goes back north to Montreal and says that's enough for now. So another kudos to Benedict Arnold for quite possibly saving the revolution. Of course, we don't know what would have happened had he not stopped Guy Carleton's fleet, but it would not have been good. I guarantee you that. All right, so Arnold has another victory. He's the hero of Valcour Island. And finally, the Patriot Army staggers into Fort Ticonderoga. Here's John Adams again, our designated go-to guy for great quotes. John Adams said they were disgraced, defeated, discontented, diseased, naked, undisciplined, and eaten up with vermin. So that's an interesting quote, isn't it, Scott? It was almost great alliteration for 4 words, but then he couldn't think of a word for naked that started with a D.
Disrobed?
Disrobed, there you go.
Doesn't have the same panache, so I see what Adams was doing. But I thought it was interesting, this event right here, the Quebec Campaign, which was not successful, but Valcour Island, which was successful, these stories have been almost completely eclipsed, and you're going to talk later about Henry Knox, and that is something that is a much better run. I won't give it away. But the retreat from Quebec, I said earlier, you don't see anything like this. Maybe Napoleon's retreat from Moscow or other like absolutely death-defying, harrowing things where you're shocked that soldiers are even able to live to make it back from there. Why was this event eclipsed in the public imagination from what we're going to see with Henry Knox? I'm guessing it's because Benedict Arnold is at the cockpit. That's my best explanation.
That's what I was going to say too, Scott. Yeah, it may be that later generations of historians and teachers in general wanted to downplay everything Benedict Arnold did. That may be why nobody knows about the attack on Quebec in general, and definitely not Valcour Island.
Right. We're veering a little bit into historiography of how history is constructed. But in the series that James and I did on the Civil War, we mentioned that the first generation of historians of the Civil War were Confederates, some of them Confederate generals, and they crafted a narrative that has been successfully repeated even up to this day of justifying why the South did what it did, that racism, that slavery was on the eclipse, that wasn't the main point of the war. I would venture to guess, I don't know really the historiography of the Revolutionary War, but I would assume that from the very beginning, casting Benedict Arnold as a villain and somebody who's writing a history of the Quebec Campaign would, like you kind of joked, James, earlier, that a quarter of the troops that are captured, the Patriot troops, end up fighting for the other side. Some historian writing in 1820 would say, under the devilish direction of Arnold the traitor, they decided to throw their allegiances into the fire and fight for the ignoble British, whatever. So that's my idea of we might be seeing a little bit of historiography at play, but I don't know for certain, so this is my speculation.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good guess. Okay, so let's sum up this campaign, this failed attempt to take Canada.
Yeah.
By the end of the campaign, the Patriots had suffered 5,000 total casualties. That, in Revolutionary War terms, that is huge. The Civil War, that's like one day, right?
Right.
But, just all in a day's work. But obviously, the numbers of casualties that we're going to see in the Revolutionary War are much smaller, as are the sizes of the armies. So 5,000 casualties, that is a huge amount. And that's something that the Continentals could ill afford to lose. That was just extremely painful. I mean, it would always be painful to lose 5,000, but when you have a ragtag army that's mainly made up of militia, a lot of whom just go home after a few months, 5,000 killed, wounded, and captured, that's just irreplaceable. It's just awful. And this would be the first and only campaign that the Americans make on Canada in the Revolutionary War. Now, they're going to try again in the War of 1812, but maybe we'll do another series on that in the future. We're not going to talk about the War of 1812, other than what I just said. But so this seals the fate of Canada, in that Canada is never seriously going to be thought of as a potential recruit to the American cause. They're going to stay firmly within the orbit of the British Empire.
And some Revolutionary War historians have questioned the logic of even thinking of this campaign in the beginning. Even if everything had gone perfectly, even if all of Benedict Arnold's forces had been woodsmen who could navigate well, and let's say they were able to lead a successful siege and capture Quebec and Montreal and everything else, there wouldn't have been an ability to defend Quebec and Montreal against British sea power. Whatever the Patriots have, they will never have parity with British sea power in any conceivable way. And by stroke of fortune, later on in the war, through turns of events and new alliances, I won't give anything away, spoilers, but the Patriots